This is Cavatina, composed by Stanley and arranged and performed by John Williams. Since its composition in 1970 and its popularisation in 1978, it has become a staple of classical guitar repertoire and one of the instrument's most popular pieces. I've been uploading videos on this channel for over a year and a half, and in all that time I've never actually made anything about my instrument, guitar, or more specifically, classical guitar. I did do one video about left-handedness in music, which talks about the guitar a lot, but I've never actually just talked about it. This is mostly because classical guitar lives mostly within its own little world. Repertoire is more rarely performed, it's a particularly idiomatic instrument that's very hard to write for unless you play it, and it's largely existed in the Mediterranean world, especially Spain, often cut off from the classical European powerhouses of Germany, Austria, France and Russia. We're better to first look at it then than Cavatina, as I said, one of the last century's most iconic works for the instrument. It's not a particularly complex piece, and this video is pretty small in between some bigger projects, and make sure to subscribe so you can stick around for those. But it was one of my first favourite pieces when I started classical guitar, so I thought it'd be nice to talk about today. Normally when I make a video about a specific piece, especially a relatively well-known one, I'm confronted with an immense amount of previous literature on the work. Take for instance my last video on different trains. For a piece that's only 3.5 decades old, it spawned an immense amount of writing on it. Now that's different because it's got more conceptually new about it, and it also sits in the more general canon, whereas classical guitar sits outside it. But even so, for a piece of its relative prominence, I was astounded to see how little had actually been written on Stanley Cavatina, especially considering it was used as a theme for Michael Cimino's The Deer Hunter, a film which would pick up Best Picture and Best Director at the 1979 Oscars. A cavatina originally referred to a short operatic aria without repeated sections, but has since become applied to any simple, melody-dominated piece of music. The piece is surprisingly difficult to play. The stately tempo and basic melody and arpeggiated chord rhythm don't sound particularly intricate, but the fact that it was originally written for 2 guitars and is recorded with 2 guitars on the famous Williams recording means that so much of it is harder than it sounds. This challenge principally comes from the fact that so much of the piece is barred. The fretting hand doesn't actually spend too much time contorted into really awkward positions, but it spends enough time in mildly uncomfortable ones to make the whole piece much harder than it sounds. It's not impossible or anything, I think it was in grade 7, but it sounds like a much more basic piece than it actually is. The opening melody is very simple, mostly just 1 note per bar, with the exception of a couple of little semiquavers. All the while we hear constant lilting quavers in 3/4 providing the accompaniment, something that remains near unchanged throughout the piece. The opening is very rooted in the home key, E major, going 1, 3, 4, 2, 7, 5, 7, 1 major 7. For the first time then, we pull a little away from E major, with the D sharp falling to a D natural. The resultant E7 chord stands out as decidedly different from the E major 7 chord of the previous bar. We're beginning to move somewhere here. As the E7 resolves to an A major 7, the strings enter. The strings aren't transcribed here, but they broadly just play full chords throughout, giving a warm, luscious bed for the guitar to sit atop. The piece then cycles around the circle of fifths, all the while the melody remaining very slow moving. It cycles A, D, G and C, all playing major 7th chords. The chord then slips down a semitone from C major 7 to B7 sus4, keeping the E in the melody before resolving back to the tonic of E major. This is where the melody reaches its highest point, arpeggiating an E major 7 all the way up to that very top E, 2 octaves above middle C. Actually 1 octave because the guitar is transposed an octave, but that's kind of by the by. We hear another 2-5-1 cadence, but this time modulating the piece briefly into the dominant key of B major, when the B major 7 chord is heard. I particularly like this moment because rather than hearing an F sharp 7 or F sharp 9 with the 3rd as the dominant, we hear an F sharp 9 sus4, meaning that we never hear that A sharp. When the B major 7 comes, therefore, the A sharps of the B major 7 come as a little bit of a surprise, because until it's heard, it still sounds like a 2-5-1 in E, with the B major being the dominant and the 2 chord being the F sharp. But we quickly then move back into E major. All the music I've talked about so far, up to bar 25 of the piece, actually existed before most people realise. Although it's now most famous for being in The Deer Hunter, Cavatina was first used in a relatively obscure 1970 British crime drama, The Walking Stick. This version, also for classical guitar and strings, was not played by Williams, but rather an uncredited London session guitarist. The performance is fine, but you can tell how much more the melody shines out when played by a guitarist of the ability and stature of Williams. By the time they got to Cavatina, Myers and Williams had recorded together before, working together on the 1971 film The Raging Moon. Since, as Williams said, this worked so well, Myers and Williams would work together again on a record called Changes, the album that would eventually contain Cavatina. They were working together in Olympic Studios in Barnes, London, and when they finished the session went to an Italian restaurant on the corner of the Fulham Road, just a hop across the River Thames. In the restaurant, jazz pianist Alan Clare was playing in the piano bar downstairs, and when a free moment arose, Myers played that now famous melody, and the Williams-Myers-Cavatina partnership was born. Their version expands upon the main melody from The Walking Stick. We get another A sharp here, with the melody ascending chromatically from G sharp through to B. Bar 31 features the first departure from the quaver accompaniment and long note melody with this little quaver line. The strings also drop down, becoming much more subdued here, allowing the guitar to really shine through. This is where we find the most harmonically interesting part of the piece. The harmony has been drifting slightly away from E for a bit, but here it goes a little further still from home. We hear 3 5-1 cadences in a row here, in B minor, E flat minor and A flat minor. The melody here is also in a much lower register, giving a darker and more mysterious feeling when combined with the harmony. We move between the fairly distantly related B minor to the E flat minor through the common tone of D natural in both the B minor chord and the B flat 7 chord. These bars really emphasise the minor ninth in the melody, giving it a particularly expressive quality, since the melody thus far in the piece has really focused on chord tones and at most suspended fourths. Of course, A flat minor is only one position round on the circle of fifths from E major, moving us smoothly back into the home key. Aside from a little journey into A, most of the rest of the piece is repeated material that I've already discussed. According to Michael O'Toole, who has written extensively on Williams, Cavatina, and the whole Changes album, altered the entire shape of Williams' career. The piece would reach the top 20 of the UK singles chart in 1978, the same year that The Deer Hunter would release, peaking at number 13. Cleo Lane released a version on her 1976 album Best Friend using the title He Was Beautiful, containing lyrics added by her that she wrote whilst in Malta.
He was beautiful.
The Shadows would even release a version. This was the 1970s and early 1980s. British package holidays to Spain were growing in popularity and accessibility. The Spanish guitar, therefore, towed the line perfectly of exotic, but not too exotic, in the popular British imagination. So says Miguel Mira, a British composer of Spanish descent. John Williams is an Australian man. He was born in Melbourne. He speaks with an albeit fairly faint Australian accent. But his father, who was also his initial guitar teacher, was English, and he would be trained at London's Royal College of Music. Williams, despite being Australian, therefore, is part of this mid to late 20th century British guitar tradition, hence why I'm talking about England and Britain so much rather than Australia. The success Myers found with Cavatina was also what led to him using the classical guitar as his instrument of choice for the theme to Question Time, which he would write a little later on. Perhaps even more surprisingly, Andres Segovia, undisputed king of the classical guitar, but also something of a bitter and grouchy old man by the time Cavatina grew to popularity, offered his praise to the piece, calling it a pretty tune, but not saying anything else. This is high praise from Segovia, a man of significant musical conservatism and snobbishness, in the words of Williams' biographer, William Starling. When Stanley Myers died in 1993 at the age of 63, John Williams would perform Cavatina at his memorial service. Thanks so much for watching. This is just a small video about a piece of music that I quite like, but make sure to stick around for some really exciting upcoming videos I have. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then consider checking out some of my others, leaving a like and subscribing, and best of all leave a comment because I always love hearing what you all have to say about the music that I talk about, and hopefully I'll see you next time.